You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back. We are here. We've got an interesting topic. I like this one. Talking about like when you should not teach. Because I do think we've talked about this a little bit between the two of us already, but we do think that there are some times, as I think many of you do, that we should not teach. And I think it gets us into some more interesting conversations, I think, later on in the episode too. So stick around and we'll start with the obvious ones first, I think, to get those out of the way. But yeah, a really interesting one, I think, to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation that's probably not talked about all that much, because usually the conversation is how do I get to teach? How do I get classes? How do I get one-on-one students? How do I build up a sort of like a sustainable career as a teacher? And we don't often, or anywhere near as often, talk about the scenarios where you probably need to back away. And so that's why I thought there might be some juice in this one. Although you're right, probably not in the first couple of points.
Well, and I think you mentioned, and we both mentioned this, is that, obviously it's a privilege just to decide not to work. Like most of us as yoga teachers, we have to show up. We have to show up for the income. We were talking about this before the episode too, like all the years that we spent, hustling and having to be there all the time. And I think pre-COVID, it was really different too, where you would draw that line as to like whether you were too sick to teach. And, I think especially as a yoga teacher who's struggling to survive, I think it's a different question nowadays, but it is a privilege just to be able to decide not to work, of course. So starting with
when
that
you don't
caveat.
have sick pay or holiday pay and your only means of gaining income is by showing up to teach, there can be some ethical dilemmas right there. But if we sort of set that to one side and assume that you have the level of privilege that you can choose, then these are the kinds of scenarios that are inevitably going to come up if you teach for long enough. And the first one, I think, is the easiest. I think you shouldn't teach when you're contagious. And it sounds really obvious post-COVID, but definitely pre-COVID, I would show up as long as I could croak out some words, I would show up to teach. And I think the pandemic did really generate the conversation around, who are these people going home to? Maybe all the people showing up are fine and their immune systems will fight off whatever bugs you spread in the room, but there might be vulnerable people at home. And I think working with older adults, this came up for me a little bit before the pandemic in the context of one-on-ones, because I think when you're teaching a group class, at least the people coming to a group class are coming with the understanding that they're going to be in a room with other people and they're going to be breathing in a room with other people. So they're going to be exposed to something. They might not assume that they're going to be breathed on with, germs or viruses, but they're out in public. Whereas my one-to-one students, I was going to their home and sitting right next to them very close for at least an hour. And that was when I started contacting students before class to say, look, I'm fine, but I've got a bit of a sore throat or my partner's been sick. And I just thought I'd give you a heads up in case you're feeling like your own immune system is a little suppressed. I don't want to bring anything that you're not comfortable having in the house. And so that was really the first conversation in my own mind of maybe there were scenarios where I shouldn't teach, even if I was physically capable of doing so. And I still think one-to-one students, it's a slightly different equation in your own mind than showing up to a public place to teach a group of people. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if you know that you're sick, I think it's our duty to not spread that. I mean, we know now that, especially after COVID, I think everyone's aware of the fact that we can shed things before we actually have symptoms, and there's really nothing we can do about that. So, there's a lot of this is out of our hands as human beings living and breathing in the world, but I think it is up to us to do the best we can to limit that as much as possible. Like really mostly, and like you said, because not just for the people in the room, but the people that they might go home to, the elderly people who, maybe they work with. So, I just think that's our responsibility as a human to do the best we can, to not to not spread those things.
Agreed.
So yeah.
So scenario one is pretty straightforward. Don't teach when you are contagious and you know it. I mean, obviously there are scenarios where you don't know yet, but when you know it, you probably shouldn't go. And the second scenario I think is also pretty straightforward. If you can't reliably stay in the room, if you're going to have to leave to, be sick or use the bathroom or cry, if you're not confident enough in your capacity to be able to stand up and get words out, you shouldn't be teaching.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. To like stay in the room. I mean, that could be nausea, that could be going to the toilet, it could be sick, it could be, there's a lot of things. And if you're unsure of being able to hold that space, I think it's probably better to, I mean, if there are medical issues that you can attend to in other ways, obviously, maybe there's another way to deal with those or monitor them. But, if you're not sure, I think it's probably a good one, a good rule of thumb if you can't stay in the room.
And for me too, really acute emotional scenarios as well, where,
Yeah.
there's a time when you're going through something where maybe you don't have it resolved or you don't have it handled, but you're capable of moving through the world, and you might feel a little bit like you're moving through the world sleepwalking, but you can engage in conversation and control your responses. But sometimes when you're in a really new phase of an emotional situation, you can't always, and the littlest unexpected thing might cause you to cry or to lose control of yourself. And that's another scenario where I would try to get cover for my class or cancel a session with a client, because any little thing could be the thing that sets me off. And having cried in front of students before, it's not a situation I would care to repeat and probably doesn't fit well with being in the seat of a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this one firsthand. Very recently, I think, for all of us, we all go through emotionally challenging times for one reason or another, and times where we just can't show up for other people. I know for
Mhm.
myself, I've felt really guilty lately because there's so much going on in the world that seems so much more important than my small trivial problems. But yet, when we're going through those emotional, those problems that are so overwhelming and so all consuming, there's really nothing we can do about it in, at least for an acute period of time. And so for me as a yoga teacher, there's a lot of emotionality to our lives. There's a lot that we can still work through and teach from. And I think for me, I actually really do appreciate the emotional moments of my life to be able to kind of connect to those human threads, these things that I know we all experience. In my own experience recently too, I've had so many people like crying out to me and their own challenges, and it's been really nice to connect to that. And as a teacher, being able to show up in a way that connects to that in a way that supports everyone in the room, not just speaking to, in my example, people who have experienced heartbreak or, things like that might not resonate with everyone in the room, but finding a way to connect to it that everyone can connect to so that I can show up and be real and be myself. But again, if I know that I'm in that very acute phase where I'm very fragile and not able to not cry, then it's probably better to cancel it, which I
Yeah.
did at the beginning of the month. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I did cancel an online live class.
Yeah. And I think
So
you're sort of sneaking us toward the third scenario, which is where you can't get past your own needs to focus on students. And the scenario that comes to my mind in this one is when you are past that acute stage and you're in more of that sort of sleepwalking phase, like you're moving through the world, you don't feel as connected to it or engaged as you would normally. But you could still, teach a class, you could still show up and say some words, but in your head, you're in your head as opposed to being connected to your students' experience. And this is where I think it can be much more difficult to determine when am I actually able to show up and not just put my own problems to one side, but show up authentically the way that you were talking about, show up imperfectly, show up not as robot teacher, as my best and most eloquent self, but just as me going through whatever I'm going through, but with enough reserves to be there for my students as well. So this is the scenario I feel like where there's a lot more gray area of there might
yeah.
be scenarios where you shouldn't teach, and there will be scenarios where you certainly can teach, and you might even teach a really good class.
And I think I agree. I think there's a lot of gray area here, and I don't necessarily think that you have to be like emotionally ready to come back and turn it into some really deep, wonderful class.
Right.
Like I remember my first class back after my, we'll just call it emotional turmoil, my very intensive holiday. I was really happy. It was a conditioning class, and at the beginning of class, I just said something like, "I'm just really glad to be here and be
Mm-hmm.
with everyone, and just and just get into it." Like it was really simple. It was really, I mean, it was a hard workout. It was conditioning class, but it was. I think it's okay sometimes to somewhat. I'm gonna say go through the motions, even though it's so not what we often do at yoga medicine. I think the purpose of that is showing up and having that reliability. And then sometimes, for our own evolution and journey, like it kind of helps us get out of ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
and get out of this little bubble that we've been in, maybe emotionally at some point. But it doesn't have to be like this amazing, mind-blowing class. Like you could just have a very simple, and I think sometimes, a lot of times, really simple classes can be great then, because you can lean into maybe other components of the class that are really interesting. For instance, for me, I think just leaning a lot more into the kind of more heartfelt sense of the practice and the deeper meaning behind it. With very simple physical practices can be really interesting in those times. And again,
Yeah.
not that we need to overthink it, not that it needs to be mind blowing. When that happens, it happens, and that's wonderful. For me, that happens though just from like chewing on it myself and thinking about how it might relate to everyone. How everyone can connect to these challenges, these emotional challenges that we all face. We
Yeah.
all suffer. We all try not to suffer. We all want to be happy. It's like it's all a shared experience. So finding ways to connect to it. With everyone, I think, is big.
Yeah, I think you've put out 3 points there that I really want to underline. And the first one is that getting back into your normal routine can be really helpful for you when you've been in a period of turmoil, or you've undergone some massive stress, or even you've been sick or unwell, whatever the thing was that caused you to not teach. Getting back into teaching, even when you don't feel 100% ready, can be a really grounding experience. Just to put your own troubles to one side for a moment and to be there with the people that are there can be really helpful for you. So that's one thing that I
Absolutely.
wanted to
Yeah.
underline. The second thing I wanted to underline was that I have taught some of my best classes when I've been less than my best self, and I've been on my way to teach and realized that I don't have the energy or the focus or the creativity or the motivation that I hoped to have. And I've scaled the class right back to reflect that, because I can't fake it. I can't teach a really upbeat, fancy class if I'm not feeling that way. And I've scaled it back to something slower or simpler. They have been some of my most impactful classes, simply by showing up how I was feeling on the day, scaling back on the things that I didn't have the energy to support, and just letting the practice do the work. Those have been some really powerful classes. And to me, that was really reassuring to know that I didn't have to be, 110% every single time, that the practice itself can be enough to hold space.
I completely agree with this. And I think my sense in this one is, and maybe this is just personal to me, but for me, it's like a letting go. It's like this sense that I'm, maybe don't have energy or inspiration or motivation, or maybe there's something going on, or I had a busy day or stressful day or something, but like
Mhm.
there's this moment of just like letting go and kind of surrendering to it. And yes, having maybe a really simple flow, but then sometimes there's something about that, the magic of the space that it leaves for those introspective moments and for the little questions that you can drop, or, that more personal, not even personal touch, but that not personal to me as the teacher, but personal to them as the student.
Yeah.
That personal touch, of allowing it to be something maybe a little deeper, which I agree can be really nice.
Yeah. And the other thing that you said that I think is also really worth pointing out is you don't have to take the thing you've just been through and immediately, through alchemy, turn it into magical gold. You don't need to come back,
Yeah.
It's 2 days later and I've completely processed it and I've come out the other side, and now here's some pearls of wisdom that I'm ready to share with you. Just to show up as yourself, how you're feeling on the day is enough. You don't You don't have to magically process it yet or anytime necessarily. And I think just going back to what you were saying about letting go, the key for me that makes it a yes, you should teach scenario versus no, you should not teach scenario is when you're able to be there mentally, physically, emotionally, be there with however you are able to show up with the people who are there in the room, even if it's a slower class or a simpler class, even if you're talking less, or even if you don't drive home the teaching point that you hope to, when you're able to be there fully, then yes, you're right to
Yeah.
teach. But if you can't, if you're distracted, if you're checking your phone or losing track of your thoughts because you're thinking about whatever issue you're thinking about, probably you're not able to hold space for students.
Well, and I think that the part of that too that you're alluding to is like be there for them. Like
Yeah.
I have to be able to get out of myself and my own
Yes.
stuff. And sometimes that's really welcome, like at the at the certain stage of this emotional
Hmm.
processing of whatever that might be. Like I have to be able to like be there for them. And as a teacher, that's what it's all about. And I think for me, this is also the key to like being okay public speaking. I've never been a great public speaker personally. I get nervous, I feel overwhelmed, like I have anxiety about it. But for me as a teacher, I'm just thinking about how am I helping these people? What am I doing for them? How am I showing up for them? It's really about that thing and not about me performing or needing to be a certain way. And I think it's the same here when we talk about, when you can show up and when you can't. You got to be able to hold space for other people. You got to be able to like step out of yourself to some extent, even though I'm still like in my own experience in many ways to guide the class. Yeah, I think that's a big one.
That's the key, that you're showing up however you are today. You're not having to fake being better than you are, however you are today, but you're showing up for the people that come. They're not having to show up for you. You're not turning it into a, here's the shit that's happened for me this
Yes.
week. And you're
Oh
not
my
turning
gosh.
into a
We've all
drama
had
that,
those moments. We've all been to
right?
those classes. Sometimes you're a little
Right.
like, do they know how long we've been in this pose? I
Yeah.
mean, and I think there's such a fine line too, because there's a realness to that authentic, like grit and humanness that we can all share from. But we
Mm.
have to be able to, as a teacher, to pull that together in a way that's relevant and not my own therapy session,
Right.
obviously. So,
And
yeah.
this to me is really where the discernment comes in. As usual with a yoga medicine podcast, we've given you a couple of simple scenarios, but we've given you one where there isn't an answer that we can give you. You need to give yourself that answer. And that's where I think discernment as a teacher comes in, having a really good grounding in your own physical, mental, and emotional state, being honest with yourself about what's going on for you and whether you have enough reserves to show up for other people or not. And there's no quick fix for that. There's no 3-step guide for that or flowchart or questionnaire. You just need to know yourself well enough to know whether you're able to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
So
And
is
I
that
love
scenario 3?
Yeah,
Tick.
and I love
Yeah.
the last one. I think this one's really interesting too. We'll touch on briefly. It's just, is there a time when you need to permanently stop teaching a class or a client? Like what are the times when it's just time to be done altogether, which is a good.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a much bigger nugget for me. The first 3 are about I've got a class or a client today or tomorrow, and I've got something I'm dealing with that makes me question whether or not I'm going to be able to do that class or work with that student the way I'd like to. This one is much longer term. And I think anyone who's been teaching for a while will have had these thoughts run through their mind of, am I sort of done here? Have I given what I can, or are we heading in different directions? So this last scenario, I think, is a much bigger and longer term bucket of when is it time for you to step away and give that opportunity to somebody else?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different reasons. I think the one that comes to my mind first is just sustainability as a teacher. I need to be able to balance my schedule so that I can show up in the ways that we've talked about to
Mm-hmm.
be there, to be present, and many of us have a lot of other things that we're juggling, whether that's our family
Mm-hmm.
or our other job or other things going on in our lives. And so I think sustainability is just a question we all have to sit with. And as yoga teachers are notorious for, teaching a lot of classes especially if you're full time. Um, and, and we could thrive on that. Like when I was in Chinese medicine school in my early 20s, um, I taught like so many classes. I would teach in the morning at 6 a.m. I would teach in the night at 7:30 p.m. I would go to school all day long. I would teach on the weekends. I think I had like 10 classes, which was a lot for me on top of an a overly full load in school and all of that. And but it worked for me. I actually loved it. I thrived. I enjoyed it. I look at it now and I'm like, I do not know how I did that, but
Somehow I
you know,
did.
it worked for me at the time. And so we constantly have to reassess what is sustainable. Am I finding joy? Am I getting inspiration from this? Yes, it's tiring. We all have ups and downs of that. But, being able to look at that big picture of the sustainability of it. And, a lot of our teachers in yoga medicine, as they go through more of the therapeutic trainings, start doing more one on ones and balancing their schedules. I think for most people, it's a lot less of an energy drain. It's a more sustainable balance. But yeah, finding that balance and then workshops or teacher trainings or other things that they're doing to balance
Yeah.
their income.
And I almost feel like there are two different scenarios here in this sustainability piece. One is a sort of schedule or timetable one of, do you keep teaching the late class on a Monday night and the early class on a Tuesday night? Or you've got
Mm.
2 daytime classes that are close enough in time that you can just get there if the traffic lights are right, and you maybe speed a little bit on that one stretch of open road. Those are the questions that, I often teach in the 200-hour teacher training to say yes to everything, say yes to every opportunity that comes up. But there is a time where your schedule is full and you're going to start feeling the temptation to, and I would suggest that you follow that temptation to make the schedule a little bit more reasonable, assuming you have other alternatives like one-on-one clients or workshops or something else to fill that income gap. Start to think about the pinch points in your schedule of where you feel really rushed and pushed, or where you're not quite getting enough downtime to recharge between classes, or the drive is too intense, or any one of a number of things. So the schedule piece is one that definitely I think happens, different times for different people, but somewhere between 6 months or 2 years into teaching, if you're teaching full time and you've said yes to everything, eventually your dance card is going to be too full and you'll need to start trimming back. The second piece is more about that energy balance of what you're putting in versus what you're getting out. And I know that sounds really transactional, and I don't mean it that way at all, because every class and every student requires an output of effort. It's a job. You do have to put in time planning a sequence or researching their injury or, looking at your options. You've got to spend time getting to a space and tidying it up. You might spend time checking in students, tidying up the space afterwards. There's always going to be an output. But I feel like when a class or a student is well aligned with you, you get fulfilled mentally, intellectually, emotionally. You feel like you're doing good work, even though you might be tired or, whatever. There is a payback to you in terms of satisfaction and fulfillment, a feeling that you are adding to the good in the world, for want of a better way of saying that. And sometimes that's not the case. And that could be because the class just isn't a good fit for you. And the example I always think of in my own mind here is when I was first teaching heated power vinyasa, and it wasn't something I'd practiced before my teacher training. It kind of came up after. I don't do well in heat, and I'm not a real yoga workout person. And so I had a sort of brief infatuation with, oh, I can sequence with arm balances. That's kind of fun. Or I can go from this really fancy bind to, another really fancy bind. Or what's a really difficult way I could transition from that pose to that pose. And in the short term, it was a good creative sort of challenge. But after time, gosh, that got tiring. Having to come up with something fancy and new every single week, having to remember it in this room where I was dripping with sweat and blotchy and greasy and not handling the heat very well. And also looking out into the room at a group of mostly office workers who were real type A's and were probably already pushing themselves too hard and really didn't need me cracking the whip for another 90 minutes at night. That was where the equation for me didn't balance. it wasn't the time of sequencing or getting there. It wasn't the time to check students in or clean up the space. It was that feeling of, I'm putting in all this effort and I don't feel like I'm doing anything useful or helpful or worthwhile. So that's where, for me, the energy imbalance became unsustainable, where I would
Yeah.
have to really crank up the music on the way there to generate enough motivation to teach. And then afterwards, I'd be completely wasted, so wiped out, because there was that internal conflict of, I don't think I'm doing good here.
Yeah, it's that mismatch. I mean, I think it's so important to teach what you love. you know,
Yeah,
like,
what you believe
yes,
in.
at first we're just taking everything. We're getting experience. We're connecting with students. We're building as a teacher, but for anyone who's been teaching more than a few years, I think it's really important to be really honest with yourself and what you like, what's important to you, what you're drawn to share as a teacher, and then being really clear about as much as you can in the description. I know some studios have generic descriptions for like, different classes for all the teachers, but I think really matching up what you love with what you're doing is really important and trying
For
to
you
avoid
and
teaching
for
the
the
things you're not
students as
interested in.
well, because
Yeah.
they deserve to have a teacher who's excited to be
Yes.
there and believes in what they're offering and is,
Yeah.
stoked to sequence the next class for them.
I mean, there's a time and a place to like fill in on an emergency for
Of
someone, a
course.
class that maybe you don't love. And that's such a gracious thing to do as a teacher because yoga studios are challenging and
Mhm.
it can be challenging to fill in those spots. And so, but for your regular classes, I feel like the word authentic has become such a catchphrase. I try not to use it, but it really fits here. Like really
Mhm.
teaching what is authentic to you. And for me, that's always been so important is, sharing things like things that I found with my patients. I would see patients all day for, and go and teach like an evening class. And my inspiration would be like the things that I saw coming up with a lot of my patients physically or mentally or stress that I was feeling in people. And it felt really meaningful to me to be able to share that as more like preventative maintenance kind of stuff. But yeah, it can be so draining to teach something that you're not really genuinely interested in. So
Yeah. Or
yeah,
where there's a
which
sort of value mismatch, because this is
yeah,
another scenario I had with a one-on-one client who wanted really deep hands-on assists to increase her range of motion. And we worked together for a while. I tried lots of different alternatives. We did yin, we did myofascial release. I did some hands-on, but I don't like giving hands-on assists. I don't like receiving hands-on assists. And I also didn't really feel like this client needed any more range of motion. She was already crazy flexible. Now, it's not my place to decide what is the correct practice for her or not. It's her body, it's her practice, it's her decision. So I'm not saying she was wrong and I was right, but I was not the right teacher for her in the long term,
yeah.
because what I thought she needed and what I was willing to give wasn't what she was interested in learning or wanted to receive. And so I think
I
that's
think
another really,
yeah, and I think all of us who've taught for a while have experienced this maybe on
yeah.
in many different ways. And um I think in those moments where we can refer them out to someone else, if possible, like if you knew
Mhm.
of someone who might be a good fit or being really honest about it not being a fit, there's nothing more freeing than not feeling like than like being honest with them and referring them somewhere else or, just having that open conversation um wishing them well and moving on
Yes.
than trying so hard. Like we put so much energy into trying to work with those people who just aren't. Yeah, and again, it's a privilege to be able to like
Mhm.
to turn people away. Of course, at the beginning you're just doing the best you can with everyone, right? So yeah, and I think all of this is speaking to the scenario where, let's just say, anything that's draining your energy,
Mhm.
that's really draining in general can be a little yellow flag of
Yeah, and I
sorts.
love the fact that you said yellow flag, because those are also kind of some of the early symptoms of burnout, aren't they? When you feel like, oh, nothing I'm doing is worthwhile. You start maybe to get a little irritated or a little complacent with the situation. This enormous privilege of teaching that you were so excited for initially starts to feel like a burden. To me, that could indicate that you're not the right match for that class or that client, but it could also indicate that you're just heading into burnout. You've been putting out a lot and not putting enough back in. So I love that concept of a yellow flag of investigating further. Do I need to get some more skills? Do I need to get some more creative ideas, or is this really not the right fit for me?
Well, and I think I say yellow too because it's very subjective.
Right.
What's red for one person is green for another, and it really is up to you to decide and listen, right? And sit with it. I think these are big decisions as a yoga teacher too. I think these are great reasons to sit on our meditation mat and just clear our mind and not really think about it and see what comes up, and really reflecting on what's meaningful to you and what's important to you in your life, what your values are, what you want to create. And I think all of those are important things. Otherwise we end up being zombies, just walking through our lives, going through the motions of things just because we think we're supposed to. And I think creating a life you love requires that reflection and honesty with ourselves, which, yeah, it's a yellow flag. Draining your energy is a yellow flag. It's not always bad. Sometimes we drain energy like athletes, like it's a good thing. We build more mitochondria. It pushes us. It can be a good challenge. It's not always a bad thing to have a low energy at times, but you got to listen to it.
There's another scenario that I hear of from teachers, which is where they feel like they've taught everything they can. Like the student has learned everything from you that they can. It's time for them to learn from somebody else. And this is a difficult one for me to relate to because I have some one-on-one clients that I've worked with for more than a decade. And I feel like there's always something. There's always something that I can learn or that they can learn, or there's something new that we're working on or playing with. But I can still see how intellectually this scenario would come up. Has this one ever come up for you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think there can be a time and a place where a student does need to move on or a teacher needs to move on. I think as a teacher too, we can become complacent and uninspired. And I think it's a great reminder for us. I think for me, I just laugh at it now when that comes up in my head because I know there's so much more that we can always dig deeper. There's always more there. And then also maybe sometimes it's just the laughing at like, oh, cute me. I think I'm bored, like when really there's so much in the nuance of just something simple and what might seem in quotes boring. And sometimes the boring is what actually is the deep work. And sometimes the work is in the boring and the monotony, and sometimes it's in the fascination of the simple things or the complex things. And I think as a student, we have to decide how we want to, who we want to continue to learn from. And I don't know that there's a right or a wrong to that. I think we all have teachers that evolve over time, and maybe we go back to ones that we had a long time ago. And I think all of that's wonderful. Really the deep work, to me, the teachers are there to guide us on our own inner work. And so it's up to us, to decide what that looks like. So,
yeah. Yeah, I think like all relationships, this one really is a two-way street, isn't it? Where there can just be these rhythms between teacher and student, of student wanting to go in a certain direction, teacher wanting to go in a certain direction. And sometimes they line up really perfectly. And sometimes there'll be a little drift in one direction or another. And sometimes those drifts are short-term and sometimes they're more permanent. And again, this is a scenario where there's not a really cut and dried, well, you knew 5 things, you've taught those 5 things, now it's time to move on. Because like you said, there are so many layers to explore. This is one of those that also requires some of that wisdom and discernment to figure out whether there are untapped areas that could be, like you said, just the simplest things like silence or repetition.
And I don't necessarily think it's a reflection of the teacher. I mean, for me, I'm always happy when students move on, or just go study with other teachers. I think it's so important. And we all evolve and change and need different things. It's the beauty of it. There's so much out there. So I hope everyone will continue to explore.
100%. Yeah, and I guess I did have one more scenario, which was to me a red flag of there's been some kind of breach of ethics or contract. You've been asked to do something that's illegal or unsafe or unethical. That to me is a red flag where, you've got to walk away from the studio or the client as quickly as you can. And I mention it for completeness. It's never come up for me. I don't think it's a really common scenario, but just to round out the list. So I feel like we've covered the bases. Any scenarios you feel like we haven't touched on yet?
I think that was a good list. Yeah. I like
So
that.
we started off with the really short term. It's today or it's tomorrow. The short term scenario of when you should not teach. The easy ones are you're sick or you can't stay in the room. The more difficult ones are when you lack that capacity to be there for your students, to show up and hold space for them. And there's so much gray area in that one that there's no easy guidelines to follow as to whether it's going to be a good thing for you and your students or not. And then we moved on to that much more long-term picture of how do you know it's time to step away from a class or step away from a student for them to find something new or for you to go in a new direction. And again, lots of gray areas there too. And sometimes it could be that sort of value mismatch, or sometimes it could just be a sign that it's time for you to go get some new information to train in something new or to stimulate your creativity in some other way, or that you're a little burnt out and it's time to refill the well a bit and give yourself something back so that you have more to give.
Yeah, that was a good summary. I love it. Yeah. And I'm sure there's others people can add that are more individualized, but I think this is it's a good way to reflect too, and remind you that it's of course always your decision. And I always, just like to remember, like, my job as a yoga teacher is to serve the people that I'm showing up for. And I think with that in mind, we can answer a lot of a lot of the questions pretty easily. Am I able to show up and serve these people, whether it's a group or a one-on-one, and do my best? I think
Mm.
sometimes it brings up these challenges of like, oh, inadequacy, or it can bring up all of those things, but it doesn't mean that I need to be any certain way, or be at any certain level. I think brand new teachers have so much to share. And it's more just about getting out of our own way and being there to serve. So,
I think that's such a beautiful North Star to hold, a compass to guide your decision making. And I love the fact that you brought it back to just showing up as you are, not as some imagined idea of the perfect teacher, can sometimes be the most powerful and the most real teaching that you do. We think our students expect us to be perfect every single day. They don't. And if they do, they're going to be disappointed pretty quickly. They're really just looking
yes.
for a real and authentic interaction with another human being. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way
Yeah.
to finish.
Oh, I
I have
love
a couple
that.
of Yoga Journal articles that I'll link to. One is on when you shouldn't teach, that more short term decision. And the other one is on how you know when it's time to break up with a class or a student more permanently. But yeah, let us know if you have scenarios that have come up for you that we didn't cover. Let us know. We'd love to hear about it and keep the conversation going.
Great stuff. Yeah. I hope it's helpful. We'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.